We've been talking about heroes, and we'll continue that again tonight. Just thinking of the author of that song, J.M. McCaleb. I heard a little bit about his background years ago in a class called Historical Missiology. Doesn't that sound impressive? It was a class on the history of missions. McCaleb, if I remember right, I believe went to China or Tokyo in the late 1800s or early 1900s. He went on a boat, not an airplane, like we get to go today. He went with very little support, but promised, if I remember correctly, from a few ladies who had chickens, that when they sold some eggs, they'd give him part of the profit, take care of him. Good enough, and he went. No real security by any means, and yet that was all he needed. What a hero in the sense of what we have today. I announced earlier about Kay Horton's father, and then as I sat down, I picked up my phone and I was scooting it from one pocket to the other, and I looked down and saw Terry had sent me a text right before church, and I didn't notice it, and this has the time of services, so it might be well to know about, I believe it's Ken Purtle, Kay's father. There's a visitation Tuesday from 5 to 8 at the Heritage Funeral Home on Battlefield Parkway. And services are going to be at 9 there at Heritage, and the burial then later at National Cemetery at 10:30. So please keep them in your prayers as well as the others. Tonight I'd like to talk about Joseph. And if you have your Bibles, you might open Genesis. We're going to start in chapter 35 and scoot on through a few different pages and then backtrack to some earlier things about his life here. The story of this Old Testament character, Joseph, not to be confused with the New Testament, one who is the stepfather of Jesus, is one who was put in a situation to help save God's people. A nation that would eventually end up in slavery, but at this point just needed God's protection. But first he has to go through a few barriers, you might say, in order to do that. And when you are living a life, as we all do, we don't know what God has planned for us. Joseph did not either, but there were things that God had in motion and direction, and in that whole process, Joseph seems to be shifted around an awful lot and dealing with a lot of things that you would definitely call uncomfortable issues of life that would make struggles for you or anybody else. As he is coming onto the scene, we look in Genesis chapter 35, and it tells us in verses 20, part of 22, and then the rest down to 26, a tiny bit about his family background. Now that's unusual and compared to most of us today. Now the sons of Jacob, that's Joseph's father, the sons of Jacob were 12, so he's got 11 brothers. Not counting sisters who may be in that process too. But the sons of Leah, that was Jacob's first wife. Yes, he had 2. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, all older brothers. Everybody, well, a lot of people have siblings, and some have older brothers or sisters, whatever. Not unusual. Now the sons of Rachel, that's the other woman that Jacob had, and then it names 2 there, Joseph and Benjamin. There's Joseph in the lot. And then the sons of Bilhah, now that was the handmaiden of 1 of 2 wives. Because when Rachel wasn't having children, she felt very distraught, and she wanted to share in this envy, I guess, for Jacob's attention. And so she thought maybe she could produce a child through her handmaiden. So she gives Bilhah to Jacob, and thus Rachel then produces, or Bilhah, 2 named Dan and Naphtali. Well, not to be outdone, then Leah, who's in the competition too. If you have 2 wives, I bet they're in competition one way or another. And so the sons of Zilpah, that's now Leah's handmaiden, are Gad, Asher, and these are the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Okay, now, so here's the family tree with a father in the middle and 4 women. and brothers on all sides, and probably some sisters along the way too. Quite an interesting thing when they sit down at family gatherings, whatever they might be. Whenever God is speaking to Jacob and he's issuing direction, and God did that, by the way, to the patriarchs, and Jacob was one of those, then there were stories to be told and things to be passed on, and as any family gathering has, they're discussing the ins and outs. And at the bottom of the list, however, are those two little boys, Joseph, almost the last born, and then his little brother Benjamin. Different situation. 10 older brothers to grow up underneath. Probably by the time he comes along, his brothers are old enough to be his father in the process, or at least some of them. And they don't really think he's anything special. Matter of fact, especially those of Leah, who were the firstborn, because he doesn't even have the same mom. He's not the original wife. That's the second wife. Of course, it was the one that Jacob chose to start with, and that's a whole different story about Jacob and Leah and how that turned out. Well, in the process, though, there's one other thing that's disclosed in Genesis chapter 37. And we jump over there because it really starts talking about Joseph there. But it says, now the story of Jacob, but then it starts talking about Joseph. You take it from what's going on here. Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the story or the history of Jacob. Then it says Joseph. So we're going to hear about him. Joseph, being 17 years old at this point in time, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now those are the handmaids, remember. And his father's wives. And so there were everybody else mixed there. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now it's bad enough that your younger brother, but when you go telling on your older brothers, that doesn't do good. I got in trouble doing that on my older brother one time. I won't discuss all the ins and outs, but it wasn't comfortable, the outcome between my brother and I because of that. Verse 3, however, says that Israel, now that's Jacob's other name, God changed it to Israel. Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age. And also, he made him a tunic of many colors. He was also the son of Rachel, his favorite wife. That's probably why you should just have one wife or one husband. You don't need favorites in that category. New Testament doesn't show anything particular about having more than one of either one. But nonetheless, there's a situation where he's growing up in an unusual family. Now, we're going to talk about this here in just a minute. But as you're thinking about this young boy that's growing up in a very unusual family situation, and now as things are coming along, we realize that he's the favorite child. You think that'd be good until you get to verse 4 when it says, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him. Not disliked him, not a little envious, they hated him. And they couldn't speak peaceably to him. Anybody that has brothers and sisters knows how things go in the house, and they're this and that, and you aggravate and tease and do whatever. And my poor younger sister got more than her fair share worth. I got it from my brother, and I just passed it on down, but a double portion, bless her heart. And that's the way things work. Can you imagine having 10 older brothers that hate you? And the things that they could come up with to aggravate you, to tease you, to frustrate you. Could you imagine just what it's like when you just walk in the door of whatever house they have, and what you're thinking might come out at any given time? It's got to be the most unpleasant thing you could ever think of. Do you have any peace in the house? No, not at all, for what it says here. They couldn't even speak peaceably to him. You couldn't even get a, "Hi, Joseph," with a smile out of them. Had been a rough life. Now, when you look at all that's going on, you think, well, you know, eventually we know what's going to happen. But you see, we know the end. Jacob is living it, and he doesn't. He's just day in and day out dealing with these 10 brothers. Well, along comes a dream, verse 5. Joseph had a dream. This is not like a dream that we have at night when we're just sleeping. This is something from God. And so Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Now, the reason for it as you look at the situation here, was because it demonstrated he was going to be over them. They didn't like to hear that. Nobody likes to be told they're going to be outdone by their younger brother, especially 10 older brothers that already hate them. Now, when you boil all of that down and what's going on here, you've got to think this isn't a good situation for him. That, to me, would be enough barrier to say, hey, I don't know what kind of faith Dad has or these brothers have, but I'm going to find something different. And in this whole process, Joseph stays focused on God. Eventually, as you well know, his brothers, when he goes out to check on him one day, because Dad, as he's done so many times before, sent him out to do that, this time they basically end up putting him in a pit, take him out just in time for a caravan to come by, of Ishmaelites, and he gets sold to them as a slave. He's gone. They're happy. He's probably screaming at the top of his lungs, please don't do this, and he's off, locked up, and he's head out on some camel ride, and he doesn't know where. It's the greatest occasion for him to give up on his faith. And yet, when you look at what's going on, when he ends up being sold down in Egypt, chapter 39, as he gets down through there, it says Joseph was taken down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Now, if he was purchased as a slave, I'm guessing it probably wasn't a pleasant camel ride for however long it was to get to Egypt. How many other months or days or whatever it was. He probably ate after the camels ate, drank after they, he was nothing to them except a piece of property. Clean him up real good when you get him down to Egypt, because if you're selling a new car, you want to shine it up. Let's shine him up real good. We'll get a little price out of him. After all, he's a young guy, maybe we can get something. So they sell him into slavery. Verse 2, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. I've pondered this back and forth, and I've finally, come to the decision Joseph knew God was taking care of him. And basically because of this. Because sometimes as I've read this, I think, well, we're reading the Lord's with Joseph, but does Joseph know that the Lord is with him while he's going through this? But Potiphar understands it. And I've got to think with Joseph in the sense that God has given him, and he's a special individual, he had to understand, even in spite of all of this, God is with him. And he's moving through all this. He's got all the barriers. Now remember, he's still been sold into slavery. His brothers still hate him. He's waiting, by the way, for the rescue from Dad. But he doesn't know what's happened back home, and Dad never shows. But in this whole time, of all of this time, he's got to remember, and he does, I'm staying focused on God. He's going to do what's right, and he does that all the way through. He holds fast into what he's going on here. And as you're going through this process, you probably know the story of Joseph. Well, there's another person that enters the scenery, and it's Potiphar's wife. And that picks up right in chapter 39 too. Verse 7, I guess we'll start there. It says, now it came to pass that after these things, that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, checking him out. Might say today in our language. Maybe that's a little bit too old or ancient compared to what the young people say, but she's checking him out, and she likes him. And it's not just an instant. As you're looking at what's going on, it says, and she said to him, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. In other words, he just turns it loose and lets me have it. And he's committed all of these into my hand. There's no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now I want you to see what's going on here, because he doesn't say, I can't do this because we might get caught. No, I shouldn't be doing this, and he could come up with some other whatever reason. The boss might get upset. Maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but not right now. And he's just absoluting it on his commitment to God. And the reason he's looking at this situation and says there's no way is not because he's worried about losing his job or losing his head, but it's something that will offend God. Above all, if nobody else knows, God will know. And he's not going to do it. In our political scenery, and this is somewhat, I guess you could say, a political type of scenario here, you would think, well, I've got to do this because I'm going to get in trouble, because if I don't, then something's going to happen. And after all, this is what, we can justify all kinds of things, and people do in our day and time. Joseph's not going to do that. And so I'm looking at the long history of what Joseph has done, what he's gone through, the family situation, being sold by his brothers, who traded like a slave, and he's treated like that. He gets sold into that, and then finally gets in a situation, you look somewhat good, and the woman comes along and is going to get him in trouble. But above all, he's holding to his God. Now, that's number one for me as far as heroes are concerned, because that's a tough thing to do in our society. Especially when he's got so many things like this going against him. But he's not hanging it up. He's holding fast. In this whole process, as we're looking at this too, he also stayed morally pure in this whole thing. He refused to be with his master's wife. He talks about there's no one greater. And as you're listening to the process, it doesn't just end right there. Like she comes up one day and makes this suggestion and says, oh, okay, he's not going to do this. We'll just give up. Verse 10 says, and so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her or lie with her. And he refused to be with her. Day by day. I mean, he can't get out of it. He's a slave. And his whole thing, you see, there's the temptation coming after him every day. We know what that's like as far as our temptations and how Satan keeps coming after us. We say no one time, he's back again knocking at our door the next opportunity, the next day or whenever. Satan's not given up, the woman's not given up, but Joseph is standing morally pure. In a society where it doesn't count, in a situation where no one would know, in a situation you could just say, oh, well, why not? Because everything else has fallen apart in life. Why shouldn't I at least be blessed one time? And he doesn't do that. Because he's got a God to hold fast to and a purity to hold on to. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 8 says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's a reminder for all of us about the values of purity in a society where we live, where everybody takes advantage of doing whatever, where it's the most common thing not to move in before you're married. Matter of fact, they'll do that several times. It doesn't matter, because that's the way society is. Might not have been that way 50 years ago, but it's the norm today. Our groups of people move in, and they just share back and forth. After all, they're friends, and they do whatever. Oh, we don't have a real close relationship. We just have a sexual relationship, somebody might say. They just, whatever they feel like. It's just so distinct was that society that Joseph was in. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, to a society that is very similar, I'd say, to ours, that place in Corinth where immorality was abounding, he says, flee sexual immorality. Basically exactly what Joseph did when Potiphar's wife grabbed a hold of him one day and wouldn't turn loose. Holding on so firmly to the cloak, he let it go and he was out. He wouldn't stay because he knew that might cost him. Paul says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. I don't know if I understand all the depths of that. I know what it can do to us if we keep on getting involved with people and the disease and etc. And I'm not sure if that's all it has to do with it, but there's something terrible in there. And then he adds verse 19, Paul does in 1 Corinthians, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? and you are not your own. Growing up, we had all kinds of sayings that were so opposite that as a young person. Paul hits on it a little bit when he talks about food for the stomach and stomach for food. Like, hey, let's just go out and enjoy life. Well, we had our little quotes too growing up. Flee sexual immorality. Paul will write to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2, verse 22, flee youthful lusts. And then in 1 Timothy 6, verse 11, he'll say, flee all this and pursue righteousness and holiness. And then in Romans 12, verse 1, he says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies. Kind of interesting, he puts that in there. You should have just said yourself, that your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. Joseph was a hero because it took a whole lot to do what he did, standing with God and being moral in that way. On top of that, one more thing we could add in there, that he saw God's providence in the whole process, and he kept on trusting in spite of the fact that it didn't look too pleasant. But he knew what the outcome would be if he just hung in there. Genesis chapter 40, verse 8, a little bit after all of this story, when he winds up in prison because he gets blamed for something he didn't do, and Potiphar's wife, of course, through the lies, ends up getting him thrown in. The cupbearer comes to Joseph and has a dream. Joseph could have said, hey, let me tell you, I got dreams and I know how they do. Let me explain that. I'll help you out. After all, this will be advantageous to me. But his focus is different. He says in chapter 40, verse 8, do not the interpretations belong to God? Then he says, tell me, but I'm going to give you God first. Because I can't do this if it's not for God, you see. He saw God was in this. Chapter 41, verse 16, when he's talking to Pharaoh, and again, the same presentation now about dreams, and he says, it's not with me, but God will give you an answer. Been a great opportunity to really lay it on thick. Hey, I'm glad I'm out. I can do you a good service. Let's get in good here. Because me and you, I can tell dreams, and you'll probably have some more. And it doesn't even start there. God's taking care of this whole time through, and he's seeing this. Chapter 41, verse 52, as he names one of his sons, his son is called Ephraim, and the quote that comes after it says, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Again, God is doing all of this. He's seeing it every step of the way. He's not sure why all this is going about, and yet he's seeing it. Maybe it's starting to come to clear by then. Chapter 50, then, verses 24 and 25, as he's talking to his brothers, and he finally discloses himself to them. And they were in the shock of their lives. Did they not get scared? They made fun of him their whole life. They sold him into slavery. They told a lie to their dad about the whole process, and now they're standing before him, and he's the judge. They've been bowing down to him and didn't even know who he was. And as he discloses himself, he says, God has a plan for you. And basically, he's just put me here to take care of this. Later on, he'll talk about that plan, and he'll say, when we get through and all our people leave, you carry me out too. This man trusted God, even after his death, with commitments and direction and all that's going on. The Hebrew author, he writes in chapter 11, verse 22, says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children and gave instructions concerning his bones. All the way through. From as far back as you can see, he knew God had something going on. The dreams, yes, they were part of it. The involvement of being sold, he could see that was something that God was doing. He didn't really exactly enjoy it, but nonetheless, he trusted that God had it worked out. Now, how about us? Focus, purity, and seeing God's plan in our life. Those things I can see important for us as Christians. I'm fully convinced that maybe we don't have a specific, detailed plan like God had for Joseph. But nonetheless, God has plans for us. I think sometimes, occasionally, some specific things that come along the way. I really don't know all the ins and outs, but I can look back and just see how things happen that help me on the next path in life. You grow up as a Catholic and you think, okay, that's kind of a disadvantage when you're going to end up being a preacher. But one day it helped a whole lot when I went to Argentina and began to talk to large numbers of people that were raised as Catholics. And I'd say, I kind of understand where you're coming from. I can identify with that and open a few more doors along the way. Have you gone through struggles and things in your life, and then all of a sudden later you turn around and you think, that just helped me to help this person or that person to deal with situations. God uses us if we'll just have our eyes open and recognize what He's up to. Trust Him along the way. Keep ourselves as Joseph did, morally pure, and stay focused. Good hero, lifesaver for Israelites, and a reminder for us to be the same. Grab a piece of that, if you would. Take it home and think about it. May it challenge your life to be a bit stronger, more devoted to God. And tonight, as we close the lesson out, if your life isn't right with God, if you've been away from the church and you're coming back, if you've never been baptized into Christ, just change. Just come down front and just say, I just need a change. And you'll be surrounded by a group of people that say, we understand. We're not perfect either, but we're here with you. We stand with you. So good to have that conscience cleaned and to live with God and knowing you've got that peace. If you don't have it, then come down front while we stand and sing, please.